"You have no clearance. Step away from the aircraft." Those were the words shouted at Walter Hayes, a janitor with oil-streaked hands and a forgotten past. But when the $200 million prototype jet kept failing and the engineers were stumped, it was Walter, an old mechanic everyone ignored, who stepped in and did the impossible. What followed was a revelation that left an entire aerospace company speechless and changed aviation history forever. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now, let's get back to the story. What the hell do you think you're doing? Step away from the aircraft. Now. A sharp voice cracked through the cold metal stillness of Hangar Bay 9, bouncing off the towering walls like a gunshot. A dozen heads turned. Engineers froze mid-step. Sparks halted mid-air. And crouched beneath the gleaming underbelly of the company's top-secret jet prototype was a man in oil-stained coveralls, fingers deep inside an open maintenance panel, completely undisturbed. The man didn't flinch. He simply tightened one last bolt with deliberate calm, then slowly wiped his hands on a threadbare rag before emerging. His name was Walter Hayes, 67 years old. A face carved with the wear of years spent in machine shops and hangars. He was not on the manifest, not part of the elite engineering team, and most certainly not authorized to touch a jet worth over $200 million. But here he was. "I said step away," the voice barked again, this time louder. It belonged to Nathan Rowe, the lead project engineer, a man half Walter's age and twice as loud. He stormed forward, fury contorting his face. "This is a classified prototype. What part of off-limits don't you understand? You're a damn mechanic. Stick to sweeping the floors." Still, Walter didn't argue. He just looked up at Rowe with patient, clear eyes. "That coolant relay line?" Walter said quietly. "You've got it mounted against a hot air bypass. It's warping under pressure. That's why your thermal stabilizer keeps misfiring." Rowe blinked. "What did you say?" "The heat's curling the line. It's not the alloy that's the problem. It's where you've placed it." Murmurs rose from the nearby techs. Some glanced at their datapads. Others looked to Rowe, waiting for him to laugh. Dismiss him. Crush him. But he didn't. He just stood there, dumbfounded. At that moment, the massive steel doors behind them began to grind open. Every head turned. Mason Carr entered the hangar, tall, sharp-suited, eyes like frost. The CEO of Orion Aerospace didn't waste time. And when he arrived in person, it meant someone's head was about to roll. He scanned the room like a hawk until his eyes landed on the jet and the man standing next to it. "What's going on?" Carr's voice was quiet but loaded. Rowe straightened immediately. "Sir, we found this man, tampering with the aircraft, unauthorized personnel." Carr stepped closer. His eyes narrowed at Walter. He studied the lines in his face, the grease on his collar, the calmness in his bearing. "Name?" he asked. "Walter Hayes." "Position?" "Maintenance contractor, Engine Bay 2, nights mostly." Carr turned to Rowe. "And what exactly was he doing?" "Claimed he fixed the coolant relay," Rowe said, a note of forced ridicule in his tone. "Offered some amateur theory about thermal warping." Carr paused, then walked up to the jet himself. He leaned in toward the open panel, examined it. The components were freshly installed, tight, clean, and somehow precise. He glanced toward the internal monitor screen. A diagnostic blinked, stable. He looked back at Walter. "You fixed it?" Walter gave a small nod. "Wasn't hard to spot. Heat damage pattern made it obvious. Whoever mounted it must have followed the CAD specs, but didn't factor in field airflow variation." Silence fell over the room. Carr straightened. "You speak like an engineer." Walter looked away. "Used to be, a long time ago." Carr studied him another beat, then turned to Rowe. "Run the test again. Now, if it holds, he stays." Rowe's face turned red. "Sir, we can't possibly trust—" That wasn't a suggestion. The hangar erupted into motion. Technicians scrambled to recalibrate. The prototype was reset. Monitors lit up with telemetry lines and graphs. And there, in the center of it all, was Walter, standing a few feet away, back to being invisible. The engines roared to life. Rows of displays updated in real time. Carr stood behind the lead console, arms crossed. Rowe watched tensely beside him, jaw clenched. Internal pressure holding, no temperature spike. "Coolant stable." "Lift status?" Carr asked. The jet's rear nozzles flared softly. "Cleared for minimal thrust hover test." Carr nodded. Engage. A sudden rumble shook the air as the prototype's body lifted gently off its resting gear. It hovered for exactly 9 seconds, silent, stable, then landed again as smooth as silk. The room didn't cheer. It didn't clap. It stared. Because it had never done that before. Carr turned slowly to Walter. "You said you used to be an engineer. What happened?" Walter hesitated, then spoke. "I designed intake systems for naval VTOL aircraft, long time back. Got phased out during a political shift. Funding went dry. They kept the title, took back the clearance, left me behind. And now you fix boilers and mop floors." "Pays the bills," Walter replied softly. "Doesn't stop me from seeing what others miss." Carr looked back at the aircraft, then at Rowe. "You said you've had 5 weeks of failure diagnostics?" "Yes, sir. We ran over 50 variations. And this man solved it with a wrench and intuition?" Rowe was silent. Carr looked at Walter again. This time his voice softened. "Come with me." Walter blinked. "Sir?" "Boardroom, now." Every pair of eyes followed them as they walked out. No one said a word. Inside the elevator, Carr was quiet, but he kept stealing glances at the older man beside him. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was a mystery. When they arrived at the executive floor, Carr motioned him inside a glass-walled room overlooking the runways. "Sit," he said. Walter did. Carr sat across from him. "I need the truth," Carr said. "I've built this company from the ground up. I don't like surprises." Walter nodded, his voice low and steady. "I was never supposed to be a janitor. I was part of Project Tundra in '84. We were designing high-altitude, burst-capable propulsion systems. But our project lead took credit for my designs. I pushed back. I was erased." Carr leaned back. "Erased?" "They blackballed me, said I leaked blueprints. I didn't, but the damage was done. No job offers, no letters of recommendation. I took what I could find, eventually ended up here, just fixing what's broken." Carr folded his hands. "You still have your old designs?" Walter reached into his pocket and unfolded a sheet of yellowed paper. On it were hand-drawn schematics, decades old, lines of brilliance in pen and graphite. Carr stared at them. "What if I gave you access to a team?" Walter smiled faintly. "I'm not here for redemption. I just wanted your plane to fly." Carr nodded slowly. "And it will, because of you." He stood up, walked to the window, then turned. "I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Hayes. I believe in timing, and I believe in second chances." Walter remained still. Carr gave a thin smile. "Welcome back." A slow, reverent silence settled into the corners of Hangar Bay 9 the following morning. The prototype, still gleaming from the night before, rested like a sleeping dragon under the industrial lights. Only now, something in the air had changed. There was a new kind of hush, a reverence not for the machine, but for the man who fixed it. And yet Walter Hayes arrived the same way he always had. Quietly, no fanfare, no change in uniform. Still in his worn coveralls and carrying the same rust-streaked toolbox he'd been using for years. He nodded to the guard, who, this time, didn't ask for ID. Inside, engineers clustered in tight huddles, whispering not about thermodynamics or alloy stress factors, but about Walter. Some scoffed, others watched. A few were visibly curious. Walter didn't seek their eyes. He simply moved with the same deliberate grace, checking panels, tapping joints with his knuckles, listening to the hum of something most of them only ever read about in textbooks. He wasn't moving through the hangar. He was reading it. From the mezzanine above, Mason Carr watched through the glass. He stood alone, coffee untouched, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His gaze never left Walter. Nathan Rowe entered behind him, tension radiating off every step. "Sir," Rowe began, voice laced with resistance. "With all due respect, he doesn't belong here." Carr didn't turn. Rowe pushed further. "He's a liability. He's not cleared. No certifications, no academic standing. We can't verify his past." Carr finally spoke, but his voice was low and unshaken. "Let me ask you something, Nathan. In all your simulations, in every design revision, did it occur to you to check the airflow distortion from the heat exchanger's secondary vent path?" Rowe hesitated. "We ran all calculated models." Carr turned now. His eyes were ice. "He listened to the machine and found what your $1 million diagnostics missed. That matters more than any degree." Rowe stepped back, face reddening. "I'm not saying he's not smart, sir, but this isn't the past. We're not in the 1980s anymore. Aerospace today is algorithmic, collaborative, internationally regulated." Carr cut him off with a hand. "And still, we can't build a bird that flies without burning itself up." but he did. Down below, Walter paused at the far wing and tilted his head slightly. His hand hovered over a panel joint, not touching, just sensing. Then he stepped back, pulled a pad from his back pocket, and began sketching. "Invite him to the morning meeting," Carr said. Rowe blinked. "What?" Carr walked past him. "You heard me." 15 minutes later, in a sleek conference room surrounded by glass and brushed aluminum, the engineering team gathered. Not everyone sat. Some stood at the back with folded arms, others exchanged side glances, eyebrows raised. There were whispers, murmurs of disbelief. And in the midst of it all, Walter took the empty seat at the end of the table, placing his weathered notepad in front of him like an offering. Mason Carr entered last, commanding silence simply by presence. He didn't sit. He stood behind Walter. "Today," he said calmly, "you're going to listen." Eyes darted. Rowe flinched, but no one spoke. Carr gestured to Walter. "You may begin." Walter cleared his throat. His voice, though soft, filled the room. "I was reviewing your current airflow stabilization layout. You're using a 3-fin dorsal intake with parallel side thrusters. Good for altitude retention, not so good for lateral integrity when turning above Mach 1.4. Rowe interrupted. "We accounted for torsional stress. We used phase transition shielding." Walter didn't argue, he just flipped his notepad. "I ran a simplified vector test. No computers, just flow logic. You've got turbulence buildup on your rear port side, like a water ripple under a faulty rudder. I suggest a vent angle adjustment here." He pointed to a rough sketch. 4 degrees left, 2 degrees down. One engineer leaned in, studying the crude drawing. "That's actually consistent with our last anomaly report." Rose scoffed. "A sketch on a napkin? That's your metric?" Walter smiled, just faintly. "No, the jet is the metric. Ask it, it'll tell you." The room fell quiet. Then another voice spoke up, a young woman at the far end. Her name tag read, Delaney. "What about heat bleed from the new carbon mix we integrated last month?" she asked. "It's been causing erratic edge lift during acceleration." Walter looked at her and nodded. "Because the mix is too reactive under sonic resonance. You need a damper buffer. Silicone ring maybe. Won't mess with the weight ratio, but absorbs the vibration." Delaney blinked. "That's what I told Nathan last week." Rowe went red. Carr leaned forward, arms braced on the table. "Gentlemen and ladies, you've all trained in the science of this field. Walter trained in the language of it. And right now, our most valuable voice doesn't have a title." A beat passed. Carr continued. "You don't have to like it, but you will respect it." The meeting disbanded half an hour later with mixed emotions. Some shook Walter's hand, some avoided it, but no one denied the results. That afternoon, Carr walked Walter back through the hangar, toward the jet. The sound of boots on steel echoed softly beneath their words. "You don't speak much," Carr said, "but when you do, you say things most people miss." Walter shrugged. "I spent 30 years listening, to machines, to people. After a while, you just know what matters." Carr stopped. "Why didn't you fight harder back then?" "When they shut you down?" Walter paused. His eyes wandered to the fuselage, then to the sky beyond the hangar doors. "I did fight," he said. "But sometimes when the whole system is built to ignore you, the loudest thing you can do is quietly keep building, even if no one sees it." Carr said nothing for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "I see it now." Walter looked at it, hesitated, and shook it. Outside, the sky was beginning to burn orange with evening light, casting long shadows across the floor. The old man and the CEO stood side by side, gazing at the machine they both helped bring to life. One had built it with vision, the other with memory. And together, they had just begun rewriting everything the world thought it knew about brilliance. Night had wrapped its arms around the compound like a velvet shroud, but the lights inside Mason Carr's office burned on. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a bronze pendulum clock on the shelf behind him, a relic from his grandfather's era. Beside him, a digital monitor flickered, a background check loading line by line. Carr leaned forward, hands steepled, his jaw tight with tension he hadn't allowed himself to feel all day. He watched as the data pulled together a puzzle that didn't make sense. Not yet. Name, Walter James Hayes. Date of birth, May 17, 1958. Occupation, maintenance technician, Orion Aerospace. Previous employment, NA. Security clearance, revoked. Education, self-educated. Filed patents under multiple defense contractors. He frowned. There was no college, no degree, no military record. But there were whispers of involvement with advanced VTOL programs, a stealth propulsion initiative dated 1984, and a name buried in a now-defunct DoD report. Carr dug deeper. He opened a redacted document marked Project Tundra, declassified obsolete. The page crackled with ghosted text. Primary propulsion consultant W.J. Hayes, reassigned following alleged security breach. Testimony never submitted, clearance suspended, case closed. No hearing, no trial. Just a line blacked out by politics. Carr exhaled sharply, his mind now reeling through the corridors of every decision that had led a man like Walter, this quiet storm of genius, to mop floors while boys in suits claimed the sky. He picked up his phone. "Get me Diana on the line," he said. Minutes later, his chief of legal appeared on screen. "Mason, it's nearly midnight. What's going on? I need you to dig into the archives, look up Project Tundra, every detail, and I want to know who authorized Walter Hayes' blacklisting." Diana blinked, instantly alert. "That's Cold War era, deep freeze stuff. Unfreeze it," he said. "I want the truth, and I want it before dawn." The call ended. Carr stood in the silence, looking down through the floor-length glass at the hangar far below. Walter was still there. Alone. Standing by the jet with one hand resting lightly against the wing, as if listening for something only he could hear. Carr's voice was barely a whisper. "What else did they steal from you?" The next morning arrived cloaked in a silvery fog. By the time the engineering team filtered into the main lab, Carr was already waiting. He'd been up all night. The report Diana sent sat on the table, printed and underlined. When Walter entered, some engineers nodded with hesitant respect. Others avoided his gaze. But Carr didn't waste time. He held up a photograph, grainy, taken decades ago. A younger version of Walter stood beside a skeletal prototype, pointing toward a propulsion schematic. "This is Project Tundra," Carr said, "a secret military effort focused on vertical takeoff propulsion and stealth radar shaping. The man who designed most of its backbone technology was never publicly credited." He turned the photo. "Because this man," he said, "was Walter Hayes." The room stiffened. He wasn't dismissed for incompetence. He was erased by a superior officer who filed false claims and took control of the design. Those same stolen components went on to fuel modern VTOL craft today. Someone in the back dropped their pen. Carr looked to Walter. "I'm sorry," he said. "You didn't deserve any of it." Walter didn't nod. He didn't speak. He simply stared at the image from a lifetime ago, one he thought was buried. Carr continued. "We've spent billions hiring experts who couldn't solve the engine crisis you unraveled in an afternoon. That tells me something. It tells me we've forgotten how to listen." He looked around the room. To instincts, to experience, to people without titles. Then he made it official. "As of this morning, Walter Hayes is reinstated to technical advisory status. He will have full access to prototype development. Anyone with a problem can come to me." There was silence, then one clap, then another. Delaney stood up first. "About time." Others followed. Only Nathan Rowe remained seated, staring at the table, fists clenched. Carr dismissed the group and approached Walter alone. "I owe you something." Walter shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing." "I do," Carr said. "I owe you the one thing you were denied, a platform." He reached into his coat and handed Walter a clean access badge. This one wasn't temporary. It wasn't laminated yellow like the contractor badges. It was white, with a blue stripe. Executive access. Walter took it with slow hands. His eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. He simply nodded, heart too full for words. Later that day, Carr walked into the hangar again. This time, he found Walter sitting with two engineers in their 20s. No ego, no performance. Just three men bent over a wing schematic, pencils flying. "Why a curved blade here instead of a straight shaft?" one asked. Walter replied, "Because a straight shaft sings at the wrong frequencies. A curved one whispers. You want the engine to sing only when you tell it to." The two young engineers looked at each other, stunned. Carr smiled. This was the future. Not built by the brightest name on the roster, but by the hands that were once swept aside. And now finally remembered. They gave him a seat at the table. But Walter never took the seat. While the design meetings grew more animated and cluttered with jargon, Walter remained where he always belonged, beside the machine. Not above it, not looking down from diagrams and data projections. He stood beneath its wings. He listened to the echoes of its frame, and he saw things others could not. Carr noticed it first. The others came to see it next. It was on a Thursday afternoon that things finally shifted. Tangibly, undeniably, when Walter was invited, reluctantly, into the design review for Phase 3, propulsion optimization. The conference room was lined with smartboards in chrome. A hologram of the prototype hovered mid-air, flickering softly with pulsing data points. Rowe had been forced to cede the floor, but he wasn't going quietly. He stood beside a screen filled with formulas and color-coded graphs, speaking rapidly. If we continue refining the rear fin vector angle by even 0.3%, we can reduce drag by another 1.1%, which, paired with our composite intake redesign, will increase fuel efficiency at low altitude by... Hold on. The interruption didn't come from Carr. It came from Walter. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like steel. Rowe turned slowly, the barest trace of contempt coiled behind his politeness. Yes? Walter stepped forward, walking slowly toward the center of the room. He looked at the floating blueprint of the aircraft like a man studying a wounded animal. You're reducing drag on the wrong vector, he said. Your numbers are technically accurate, but you're using predictive flow data, simulations that don't reflect the material's behavior in real-time flight conditions. Rowe blinked. That's exactly what simulations are for. Walter turned to him, eyes steady. No. Simulations tell you what should happen, but aircrafts aren't theory. They're rhythm. They flex, they speak, and they betray every flaw when they're airborne. He picked up a stylus and walked to the whiteboard. In a few clean, confident strokes, he erased Rowe's vector map and drew a simpler, humbler curve. It looked like a child's sketch, but when he layered it over the projection, adjusting the scale manually, it aligned with the stress nodes almost perfectly. Carr leaned forward. Run it. The engineers in the back tapped commands into the model. Within seconds, the simulation recalibrated. The red indicators along the fuselage disappeared. Fuel efficiency jumped. Stability tolerance expanded. A slow murmur rippled through the room. Rowe didn't speak. He stepped back, pale. Walter stood quietly. Carr broke the silence. I think you just redrew the blueprint, someone whispered. That can't be right, another replied. It is. But Walter wasn't triumphant. He was calm, thoughtful. I didn't redraw it. I just listened better. Later that evening, Carr found him alone in the metal shop, backlit by the gold hue of sunset slanting through the loading bay. You could have destroyed him in there, Carr said. Walter looked up from the torque wrench in his hand. That wasn't the point. No, Carr said, but it was a moment. Walter put the wrench down. I don't want moments, Mason. I want the plane to fly right. Carr took a deep breath, leaned against the workbench. You know what amazes me most about you? Walter waited. You have every reason to be angry, every reason to carry bitterness in your bones, but you don't. Walter's eyes softened. Anger is loud, but wisdom whispers, and if you don't quiet down, you'll never hear it. Carr was quiet for a long while. Then he asked, Did you ever wish you'd walked away from this world? Walter chuckled, a dry, worn sound touched by pain and pride. Every day. And yet, here I am, because no matter how far you walk, your calling follows. Carr stared at him, and at that moment, he understood. Walter wasn't just a forgotten genius. He wasn't a ghost of a project lost to government secrecy. He was the kind of man who kept building even when no one was watching, even when they took everything, even when they left him in the dark. And now, when the light finally came back, it didn't change him. It just revealed who he'd been all along. The day of the test flight arrived under a sky painted in steel gray, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Hangar Bay 9 buzzed with a rare electricity, not the kind that came from circuitry, but the charged anticipation of something unrepeatable. Engineers hurried across the tarmac with checklists in hand. Technicians zipped cables into command panels. Camera crews were quietly assembling behind one-way glass, their presence muted but weighted with expectation. And at the center of it all stood the jet. Sleek, sharp, alive. But not just with design, with redemption. The prototype had evolved beyond specs. It bore the fingerprints of brilliance that could never be captured by resumes or budgets. It was now part memory, part intuition, rebuilt not just by hands, but by conviction. Walter stood a few feet away, arms folded loosely across his chest, a grease-stained cap low over his eyes. He wasn't looking at the cameras or the VIP box on the overlook. He was listening again, To the low vibration of fuel lines priming, the whisper of air under carbon fins, the pulse of power about to be tested. Mason Carr stepped beside him. "They're all watching," Carr said softly. Walter nodded without looking. "I know." "Does it make you nervous?" Walter finally turned. "No, because this time I gotta do it right. No politics, no theft, no sabotage, just the work." Carr followed his gaze to the jet. "They still don't understand how you knew what was wrong." Walter gave a faint smile. "That's because they ask the machines before they ask the people who built them." From the control tower, a voice came over the intercom. "All systems green. Proceed to hover test in T-minus 30 seconds. A hush fell over the entire base. The test pilot, a woman named Elton Marisol Vega, veteran, fierce, respected, climbed into the cockpit. She hadn't spoken much during the weeks of redesign, but when she shook Walter's hand earlier that morning, she simply said, "I trust your instincts more than a dozen schematics." He nodded and said, "Then she'll fly." As the countdown began, engineers lined the observation deck. Reporters adjusted their mics behind tinted glass. Investors shifted uneasily in their seats, knowing this test would determine billions. Carr stood behind the lead terminal. Walter stood beside him. A low rumble spread through the floor, growing, deepening, until the sound was no longer heard, but felt. The jet's turbines spun to life, and the nose dipped slightly before lifting again. Altitude hold stable, thrust response clean. Initiating lift. And then in a moment that felt like it stretched the seconds longer than time allowed, the prototype lifted from the ground with a softness that stunned the entire team. No shake, no correction, just controlled ascension like it belonged in the sky. Gasps erupted. Carr leaned in, knuckles tight on the console. "She's floating," the flight tech whispered. The jet hovered for exactly 11 seconds, then pivoted, tilted, executed a controlled yaw maneuver, rotated back, and slowly touched down so gently the wheels didn't even hiss. Test complete, 0 anomalies, full stability confirmed. The room burst. Cheers, applause, slaps on the back. Some of the engineers who had once dismissed Walter were now shaking their heads in awe. Others turned toward him, expressions soft, reverent. But Walter didn't cheer. He just watched. And when looked, Vega stepped out of the cockpit. She walked straight past the reporters, the engineers, the board members, and came directly to Walter. She held out her flight helmet. "You ever flown in one of your own?" Walter blinked. "No." She pressed the helmet into his hands. "Then it's time." Minutes later, the second test began. But this one wasn't monitored by data streams. It was watched through glass, through held breath, through eyes that had finally begun to understand what true brilliance looked like. Carr stood beside a board member who asked under his breath, "Who is this man?" Carr didn't even look away from the runway. "He's the man they thought could be replaced with software." Outside, the jet soared. Walter wasn't flying it, but he was in the co-pilot seat, headset on, hand resting on the throttle housing, watching the sky expand around him like it always should have. They hit Mach 1.2. The sky opened, and for the first time in nearly 40 years, Walter Hayes watched a machine born from his own mind rise into the clouds with no one standing in the way. Not doubt, not politics, not the past. Just truth and altitude. When they landed and the hangar doors opened again, the applause wasn't loud. It was reverent, the kind of clapping one gives not to a performer but to a craftsman. A man who had waited decades not to be celebrated, but simply to be heard. Carr met him at the stairs, and before the crowd, before the flashes, before the reporters asked their questions, Mason Carr extended his hand. But Walter didn't shake it. He stepped forward and hugged him, tightly. The kind of hug that says, "You pulled me out of the shadows." And Carr, stunned for a heartbeat, hugged him back. The applause rose again, not louder, but deeper. And in that hangar, something changed. Not just the aircraft, not just the team, but the memory of what brilliance can look like. Sometimes it wears a lab coat, sometimes it wears a nameplate, but sometimes it wears grease under its nails and silence on its lips. And when it finally speaks, everyone listens. It didn't take long for the ripples to turn into waves. By the following week, news outlets were knocking on Orion Aerospace's doors. Words like miracle mechanic, forgotten genius, and aviation whisperer danced across headlines. But Walter Hayes, true to form, was nowhere near a camera. He was back in the metal shop, sleeves rolled up, working quietly beside a young intern who barely knew how to hold a torque wrench. And yet Walter was patient, never condescending, guiding with hands that spoke decades of wisdom and restraint. But not everyone celebrated. The boardroom on the top floor of the Orion Tower, lined with glass and ambition, was growing restless. A meeting had been called. Not by Carr, by them. 12 members, one long table, half of them staring at Carr like he'd lost his mind. "I want to be perfectly clear," said Avery Langston, the board's most senior member, silver-haired and sharp-tongued. "You gave executive access to a mechanic with no degree, no clearance, and a revoked federal file." Carr didn't blink. "I gave it to the man who saved our prototype. He has no credentials recognized by our partners. He has something better," Carr replied. "Results." Another board member, thinner, more cautious, spoke next. "Mason, the investors are nervous. They're asking how someone like that got into a classified system. Do you have any idea what kind of legal storm this could trigger?" Carr stood slowly, placing both hands flat on the polished table. "Let me ask you something. If Walter Hayes had walked in here at 30 years old with a Stanford degree and a polished resume and pitched you that jet redesign, you would have funded it, wouldn't you?" Silence. "Exactly," Carr said. "So ask yourselves this, is the problem what he knows or how he looks?" Langston's lips thinned. "This isn't about appearances, it's about liability. You're dragging this company into a reputational risk." Carr stepped back from the table, face hardening. "No, what I'm doing is correcting a failure this industry made 40 years ago. And if that upsets your sense of decorum, then maybe it's time we decide what kind of company we want to be." Someone shifted in their seat. Another cleared their throat. Langston narrowed her eyes. "Are you threatening to walk?" Carr looked around the room. "No. I'm reminding you what this company was built on. Vision. Not protocol. Not polish. Vision." He walked to the door. "Before stepping out, he said one last thing. And if you force me to choose between a man who builds from brilliance and a board that governs from fear, then you already know my answer." The door shut softly. Downstairs, in the workshop, Walter was finishing a demonstration for 3 junior engineers, showing them how a minor misalignment in an actuator joint could compromise lift stabilization. One of them asked, "Mr. Hayes, why do you use feel and sound so much instead of just scanning with tech?" Walter replied, "Because sometimes the machine doesn't break the way the manual says it will." That same afternoon, Carr found him hunched over an exposed turbine, sleeves rolled up, hands black with grease. "You're becoming a legend around here," Carr said, half joking. Walter didn't look up. "That's the problem with legends. People forget they bleed." Carr's expression turned more serious. "I had to fight the board this morning." Walter stood slowly, wiping his hands. "Let me guess, they want me gone." Carr nodded. "They're scared. They see lawsuits, liabilities, headlines." Walter exhaled. "Then let me go." "No," Carr said firmly, "because the only reason this company has a future is standing right here." Walter didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just placed a hand on Carr's shoulder, calloused and warm. "Then we build that future carefully and loud enough that they can't silence it this time." The next morning, Carr made a call. A press release went out, not about the test flight, not about funding, about Walter. Orion Aerospace announces the appointment of Walter Hayes as Chief Technical Advisor and namesake of the new Hayes Fellowship, a program to mentor overlooked engineers and inventors from non-traditional backgrounds. The article exploded. Social media ignited. Young mechanics posted photos of their calloused hands. Retired technicians wrote threads about the projects they were pushed out of. And students from marginalized schools began writing in, asking how to apply to the fellowship. Walter's name became more than a footnote in a long-lost file. It became a doorway. That evening, back in Hangar Bay 9, Walter walked in just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the floor in long golden shadows. He paused at the jet, touching the nose cone gently, almost like a father brushing hair from a child's face. Delaney joined him quietly. "They're calling you the Jet Whisperer now." He chuckled softly. "They called me worse." "I'm applying to the Hayes Fellowship," she said. "Not because I need it, but because I believe in what it stands for." Walter looked at her, eyes glinting in the dim light. "Then let's make sure it stands for something real." They stood in silence, watching the last light fade. And for the first time in decades, Walter Hayes didn't feel like a relic. He felt like a beginning. They called it coincidence, a well-timed resurgence, a lucky break. But Walter Hayes knew better. The truth always floats, no matter how long it's been buried. And now, the truth was surfacing in ways that left even the most skeptical engineers stunned. It started with a journalist. Her name was Rachel Levin, an investigative reporter for a national aviation journal. Young, sharp, hungry for stories that mattered. She'd seen the press release. But what caught her eye wasn't the appointment, it was the name. Walter J. Hayes. She ran a search, found nothing at first. Then scraps, fragmented patents from the late 80s. Mentions in footnotes of Cold War aerospace trials. And finally, a name redacted in a Department of Defense report on Project Tundra. She called Carr's office for an interview. He said no. But Walter said yes. They met in the hangar at sunrise, just as the metal skin of the prototype caught fire in the light, casting long shadows across the concrete. Rachel arrived with a notepad, a recorder, and an air of caution. Walter stood beside the jet, arms folded, the cool morning breeze rustling the collar of his jacket. "I'm not here to be famous," he told her. "I'm here to be understood." She nodded. "Then let's start there." And he spoke. Not all at once, not like a man unloading, but carefully, like a craftsman shaping wood, soft edges first, then depth. He told her about the early years, working on military propulsion in the shadows of more famous men, getting credit stolen, getting warnings, getting removed, and then vanishing. "I never gave them what they wanted," he said, eyes fixed on the tarmac. "I gave them what they needed, but they didn't want that kind of mind in the room." Rachel asked gently, "And now?" Walter smiled faintly. "Now I have nothing to lose, which makes me more dangerous than ever." The article published 2 days later. "The Ghost in the Jet: How One Erased Engineer Rebuilt the Future." It went viral, not because of scandal, but because it resonated. Thousands of readers saw themselves in Walter, undervalued, overlooked, underestimated. The story was less about one man and more about a pattern, a warning, and a reckoning. In classrooms across the country, professors printed the article. In hangars and workshops, technicians passed it around like scripture. Even within Orion, junior engineers started quoting lines from it in presentations. The board? They panicked. Langston called Carr that evening. "Mason, this is spiraling. We didn't authorize this kind of attention." Carr cut her off. "You didn't authorize him being erased either, but that didn't stop you." "Mason, be reasonable." "No," Carr said quietly. "Be honest. That article just gave more visibility to this company than any PR campaign we've ever run. And for once, it's not because of our investors, it's because of our integrity." Langston exhaled, cornered. "Then what do you plan to do next?" Carr looked out his office window, where Walter stood on the tarmac with a group of students from a local vocational school, showing them how to read torque curves by ear. "What I should have done from the beginning," he said. "Back him, publicly, and build this company around people like him, not just names on degrees." That Friday, Walter received a letter. Official letterhead, U.S. Department of Defense. It was an apology. 40 years too late. A retired official had come forward, confessing that Walter had been scapegoated to save the reputation of a high-ranking colonel who later moved into the private defense sector. Walter's clearance had been revoked, not because of misconduct, but because of inconvenience. Walter read the letter slowly, then folded it, and threw it in the trash. Carr found him later, wiping down an engine part in the workshop. "You're not keeping it?" Walter looked up, calm. "I don't need an apology from the system that tried to bury me. I've already outlived its lie." Carr nodded. But later, without saying a word, he pulled the letter from the bin, pressed it into a frame, and hung it in the company's new fellowship hallway, beneath a plaque that read, "The truth always finds its way back to flight." Days turned to weeks, and the prototype? It didn't just fly, it led. Military interest surged. International contracts were considered. But more importantly, Orion's culture began to shift. Engineers no longer spoke in silos. Interns were encouraged to challenge assumptions, and in meeting after meeting, Walter's presence wasn't symbolic. It was guiding. He taught them how to feel vibration through metal, how to listen to an engine's breath, how to ask questions that didn't fit into models. And one day, without prompting, Nathan Rowe approached him in the hangar. Walter turned slowly when he heard the footsteps. Roe cleared his throat, eyes on the floor. I was wrong. Walter waited. I judged you by the way you walked in, not what you carried with you. Walter didn't gloat, he didn't smile. He simply extended his hand, and Roe took it. I still have a lot to learn, Roe added. Walter said, then you're halfway to being great. That night, alone again in the hangar, Walter stood before the jet. But this time, he wasn't listening to it. He was listening to the quiet inside himself. For the first time in decades, there was no regret, no bitterness, only peace. The kind that comes when you finally reclaim your name, not through vengeance, not through spectacle, but through purpose. The sky, he realized, had never been the limit. It had just been waiting. The jet wasn't the only thing that flew. Word of Walter's return, no longer myth, no longer mystery, began changing more than headlines. It began changing people. At Orion Aerospace, it started with one intern. Jalen, barely 22, soft-spoken and serious, used to sweep behind the workbenches without being noticed. He came from a technical high school in North Philly. No pedigree, no family in the field, just instinct and a knack for machines. One day after hours, Walter found him sitting alone in Bay 3, sketching something on the back of a receipt. You don't want to do that on paper, you'll lose, Walter said, easing onto the bench beside him. Jalen looked up, startled. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Relax, Walter chuckled. I used to sketch engine concepts on cereal boxes. Jalen turned the paper toward him. It was rough, but there was something alive in the lines, an airflow draft around a pressure-fed nozzle, angled in a way Walter hadn't seen in years. Where'd you learn this? Walter asked. Jalen shrugged. I just figured it might reduce vibration on startup. I don't know, it probably wouldn't work. Walter smiled. Not only would it work, it would work better. Jalen blinked. Seriously? Walter nodded. You ever hear of the Hayes Fellowship? Jalen shook his head. You're going to be its first scholar. By the next week, a new wing of Orion's R&D division was quietly christened the Listening Lab. No whiteboards, no polished walls, just benches, tools, raw metal, and silence, designed so creators could feel, hear, and think without pressure to perform. Walter didn't run it. He sat in it, with them. Carr visited one afternoon and found him in a circle of 5 young minds, all asking, sketching, testing, failing, laughing. He watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a soft expression on his face. You turned our hangar into a classroom, he said once they stepped outside. Walter replied, no, I turned it into a memory of what this place used to mean. Carr looked out over the runway. You know, I used to think progress came from innovation, but now I think it comes from something deeper, restoration. Walter glanced at him. Of what? Of trust, of voice, of all the people we buried with our own ambition. Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because in that moment they both knew the future wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in listening, then teaching, then letting go. That fall, Orion hosted its first Open Innovation Weekend. Not for clients, not for press, but for local schools, trade programs, independent inventors, many of whom had never been inside a hangar. Walter greeted them like family. He walked with a young girl from a robotics club who'd never left her city limits. He showed an auto mechanic from Tulsa how aircraft weight differentials worked like brake compression. He even stood quietly beside a boy who had no words, only sketches, and said, I see what you're trying to do. Let's try it together. By sunset, parents were crying. Students were exchanging numbers. Engineers who once sat behind reinforced glass now sat on the floor, handing out screwdrivers and encouragement. That night, Carr walked Walter to his car. You know what you've done, right? Walter shrugged. Taught a few kids about turbines? Carr shook his head, smiling. No. You reminded people that they were never the problem. The silence was. Walter leaned against the car. I spent most of my life watching the world tell people like me to be quiet. That we were too old, too rough, too unrefined. But the thing about being quiet that long, he looked up at the stars, voice steady. When you do speak, the right ones listen. Carr exhaled. You've changed the soul of this company. Walter turned, hand on the door. No, I just reminded it had one. And with that, he left. But his echo stayed. In the months that followed, the Hayes Fellowship expanded. Not just to engineers, but to artists, mechanics, veterans, musicians, disabled thinkers, ex-inmates with inventive minds but no pathway. Carr made sure the board stayed silent, because the world was finally listening. One day, In a meeting of high-level executives from across the industry, a rival CEO asked Carr, "What do you feed your innovation department?" Carr replied with a grin, "Second chances." That winter, Walter's office received a letter. Not from the government. Not from a university. From a 12-year-old girl in Missouri. Her brother had dropped out of school. Always said he was dumb. Couldn't sit still, couldn't memorize formulas. But after watching a video of Walter explaining airflow using a paper fan and a kitchen spoon, he rebuilt the family's broken lawnmower. Then their heater. Then her bicycle. She wrote, "He used to stay in bed all day. Now he goes outside every morning. He says he wants to fly things. Thank you for making him feel like he could." Walter sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. Then he opened his drawer and placed it beside the only other thing he ever kept framed. Not the DoD apology, not the patent filings, but a photo of the first plane he ever touched. When he was a boy, long before they tried to erase him, long before they gave him a badge, back when all he had was a dream. And now, he had passed it on and watched it take flight. It was cold the morning the prototype broke the record. Not the kind of cold that bites, but the kind that sharpens everything, makes metal sing a little clearer, makes breath look like memory in the air. The Orion Aerospace launch pad stretched out beneath a frost-touched sky, the edges of the jet glinting like a blade drawn from fire. Engineers stood in silent rows, layered in jackets and anticipation. The new investors watched from the upper platform. Press were kept further back. And at the edge of the tarmac stood Walter Hayes. No suit, no title badge, just a wool cap, old gloves, and the eyes of someone who'd seen what flight really meant. Beyond data, beyond defense contracts, beyond money. Today's flight wasn't just another test. It was the full-speed, full-capacity demonstration. The one that would either mark the beginning of a new era in aviation or be quietly buried, as so many dreams had been before. Carr walked up beside him, quiet. The two stood without speaking for a while. Walter finally said, "You nervous?" Carr exhaled through his nose. "Only because they're watching." Walter turned. "Let them." On the launch deck, Letter Vega climbed into the cockpit again, her helmet under one arm. She had insisted on flying it herself. "I trust it because I know who built its heart," she'd said. Carr remembered that, and he remembered Walter's response. "Then it won't fail you." The countdown began. Engines hummed awake. The prototype crouched low, like a beast remembering its power. Walter didn't move. Carr barely breathed. Then, launch. The sound didn't crack, it roared, not like thunder. Like something alive tearing free from the ground. The jet screamed down the strip and shot into the sky like it belonged to the stars. There was no tremble, no delay. It moved like it had memory, like it remembered every mistake, every loss, every hand that had ever tried to shape it and failed. Altitude, 41,000 feet. Speed, Mach 2.3, then 2.7, then Mach 3.0. Confirmed, the tech whispered, barely believing it. She broke the record. Cheers erupted in the control tower. Cameras snapped. One of the younger engineers wept openly. Carr closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. But Walter, he didn't cheer. He simply looked upward, hand on his heart, and whispered, "We did it, old girl." Later, when the jet returned, when Vega descended the ladder and pulled off her helmet, the first thing she said wasn't a technical breakdown or a debrief. She looked at Walter and said, "I felt her soul up there." The press went wild. The footage was everywhere. Orion's prototype breaks world speed record. Engine design baffles experts. The mechanic who changed everything. Hayes Fellowship draws international talent after historic flight. They didn't know how to explain it. Not really. So they turned it into myth. But inside Orion, no one let it become just a headline. They knew what they'd seen. Because the next week, engineers, some who had once doubted him, started coming to Walter not just with questions, but with notebooks. They wanted to learn, not how to win, but how to listen. That was the legacy now. Not the jet, not the record, but the culture. Rose stood at the front of the R&D floor one day, leading a session Walter had helped design. He paused midway through his talk and looked at the team. "I used to think design was about control," he admitted. "About making the machine do exactly what I told it to." He nodded toward the back of the room where Walter watched in silence. "But he taught me that great design is more like trust. You give it what it needs, not just what you want. You don't force it, you earn it." After the applause, Carr pulled Walter aside. "Never thought I'd see the day Roe quoted you." Walter smirked. "He still owes me coffee." Carr's smile faded, and he asked something more serious. "Do you ever wonder how different your life might have been if none of it had gone wrong?" Walter looked around at the floor. Engineers scribbling, students presenting, voices rising with ideas, and shook his head. "No, because if it hadn't gone wrong, I wouldn't be here, and here matters more." Carr placed a hand on his shoulder. "There's a plaque being made for the company's legacy wall. It'll carry every name tied to this program. Yours will be at the top." Walter hesitated, his voice low. "Just make sure there's room for the kids coming next. I want them to see their name up there someday too." Carr nodded. "They will." And when the plaque was unveiled weeks later next to the prototype permanently mounted in glass, it read, "To those who were silenced, sidelined, or forgotten. To those who built in the dark. To those who never stopped dreaming. You flew, you changed everything, and now they will never forget your name." At the bottom, Hayes Legacy Program, 2025. Walter stood before it that evening, alone. The hangar was quiet, lit only by the overhead floods casting long shadows across the empty runway. His reflection in the glass looked smaller than he remembered, but steadier, kinder. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in a lifetime of silence, steel, and sky, the world was no longer looking past him. It was looking up. The day the first Hayes scholar graduated the fellowship, it rained. Not a storm. Just the kind of soft, steady rain that hushes the world, that makes steel glisten and asphalt steam. The ceremony wasn't in a hotel ballroom or a government hall. It was right where it should have been, under the belly of the prototype that started it all. Rows of folding chairs lined the hangar floor. Among the crowd, Carr, the board, engineers from across departments, and families holding umbrellas, watching as the first class of 12 stepped forward in gray-blue jackets, stitched with the same symbol etched on the jet's tail. Walter stood off to the side, hands folded in front of him. He didn't want a speech, didn't want a spotlight. But when the last graduate received her medal, she turned to the microphone, cleared her throat, and said, "I came here thinking I wasn't enough. That I had to prove myself every day to people who wouldn't see me unless I performed. But then I met Walter Hayes, and he didn't ask me to be impressive. He asked me to listen." She glanced at him, eyes full, and he listened back. There was silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that holds something sacred. Later, after the chairs were folded and the rain turned to mist, Carr found Walter alone again. This time near Bay 7, the oldest part of the hangar. "You were right," Carr said. Walter looked up from a panel he was checking. "About what?" "This place didn't need new engines. It needed to remember its soul." Walter chuckled. "Still good to have engines that don't blow up midair." Carr sat down on the edge of a crate, rubbing his hands together to stay warm. "Do you ever think about retiring?" Walter raised an eyebrow. "I've retired twice. Didn't take." "I'm serious." Walter wiped his hands with a cloth, looked around the hangar, and then at Carr. "There's a story about a man who planted trees in a place where no one lived. Every day, just a few seeds, no one noticed. But years later, forests grew, birds came back, people returned. They asked who built it. But he was gone. Didn't care if anyone knew his name." Carr nodded slowly. "You're saying you're ready to disappear?" Walter smiled gently. "I'm saying it's time to let others plant the trees." A week later, Carr gathered the company for an internal announcement. Everyone expected another round of promotions, maybe an acquisition. Instead, Carr took the microphone and said, "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter. Not for the company, but for the man who reminded us why we build in the first place. Walter Hayes will step down as Chief Technical Advisor at the end of this month. Not because we're done learning from him, but because he's already planted enough seeds to last generations." Gasps, protests, even tears. Walter, sitting quietly in the front row, just dipped his head in thanks. Carr continued, "We're renaming this campus Hayes Field." And with that, thunderous applause. They spent the next month preparing a celebration. Not a gala, not corporate, a homecoming. On the final day, Carr walked Walter through every hangar, every corridor. Dozens of employees lined the path. Some handed him sketches they'd drawn in his classes. Some brought photos of machines he'd helped improve. One elderly mechanic simply pressed a socket wrench into his hand and whispered, "Thank you for making me proud of this again." Outside, they unveiled a sculpture at the main gate. A simple structure, two hands, palms upward, holding a model of the prototype they had built together. Inscribed on the base, "Built not to be perfect, but to be understood." Walter placed one hand on the metal and closed his eyes. He could still hear the jet, could still feel the heat, but now it was time. Time to walk away, not in exile, not in silence, but in peace. He packed his tools with care. Left a letter on his old workbench for the next mechanic who would inherit the space. It read, "Don't chase praise, chase truth. Listen harder than anyone expects, and when they laugh at your hands, let your work do the talking." Carr offered him a car. Walter chose to walk. Down the long road, past the testing fields, past the wind tunnels, past the world he helped rebuild. He carried no trophies, only the quiet knowledge that somewhere a machine would fly safer. Because of him. And somewhere, a kid with no degree and rough hands would be given a shot. Because of him. And somewhere, a company once focused on noise, now thrived on listening. Because of him. Years later, a new CEO would take over after Carr. Young, ambitious, brilliant. But in every executive briefing, in every major project pitch, the CEO would ask the same question Walter once asked in that silent hangar. "Did you listen to what the machine was really telling you?" And in the center of the main campus, under the hands holding the jet, a plaque would remain. Walter Hayes, mechanic, mentor, listener of machines, builder of belief. And across the sky, jets flew, smoother, faster, wiser. Because one man once dared to fix something no one believed he should touch. And when they asked how he did it, his answer was always the same: "I just listened." In a world obsessed with titles, degrees, and polished resumes, this story reminds us of something far more powerful: substance. Walter Hayes was never supposed to be in that hangar, not by society's standards. But he was exactly where he belonged. Because sometimes, brilliance doesn't wear a lab coat or sit in a boardroom. It wears grease-stained gloves and listens before it speaks. His journey teaches us that genius isn't always loud, and legacy isn't always built in public. Sometimes the most profound impact comes from those who quietly refuse to give up, who keep building, keep believing, even when no one is watching. So if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you don't belong, let this be a reminder. Your worth isn't measured by credentials, but by your courage to rise, again and again. Keep building, keep listening. The world will catch up.